The sky burned red over New York City, not from fire, nor from war, but from something far more terrifying: judgment. Above the tallest skyscrapers, where even the bravest heroes feared to tread, the air itself seemed to split apart, revealing the cold abyss of eternity. The celestial tribunal had spoken, and their decree echoed through the universe like a bell of doom. Jean Grey stood on the rooftop of the X-Mansion, her emerald eyes locked onto the heavens, her pulse drumming in her ears. She had faced death, rebirth, gods, and monsters, but nothing prepared her for this. The accusation was unthinkable, her privacy shattered, her dignity stolen. And the culprit? Deadpool, she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of a collapsing star. He stood across from her, mask slightly tilted, as if trying to gauge whether to joke or run for his life. His red suit, riddled with battle scars, had never looked so out of place. Here, in the presence of one of the most powerful beings in existence, Wade Wilson, the unkillable fool, the walking punchline, was the center of an intergalactic scandal. "You know," Deadpool finally said, rubbing the back of his neck, "this might be the first time in history that a guy seeing the girl in a delicate moment has resulted in universal annihilation." Jean's fists clenched. Heat shimmered around her, bending the air as raw energy coiled through her veins. The phoenix inside her stirred, whispering in a voice only she could hear. Burn him. Burn everything. And for the first time in years, she was tempted. The tribunal's celestial enforcers descended from the rift above, faceless titans of golden light. Their leader, Kronvex the Absolute, loomed over the city, his voice neither loud nor quiet, but impossibly vast, vibrating in the bones of every living thing. The transgression cannot be undone. The penalty must be paid. Jean forced herself to breathe. "I did nothing wrong," she said, her voice as sharp as shattered glass. "I didn't ask for him to see me." Kronvex was unmoved. He gazed upon the untouchable flame. "The balance is broken." His hollow gaze turned to Deadpool. "One must perish, or the bond must be sealed." Deadpool blinked. "Wait? Bond? As in, like marriage?" Kronvex intoned, and the word rolled across the city like a thunderclap. Silence. Jean's heart stopped. The wind roared through the city, scattering papers, bending steel. Deadpool was grinning. "Well," he said, adjusting his gloves, "I gotta say, this is way more romantic than my last proposal. That one involved the stolen taco truck and a ring made out of an onion ring." He turned to Jean, the playfulness in his voice doing nothing to mask the truth in his eyes. "So, what do you say, Red? Want to save the world by being my lawfully wedded cosmic firebird?" Jean's breath was ice and fire. This was madness. The phoenix inside her hissed. The thought of binding herself to him was absurd, impossible. And yet, if she refused, he would die. She could feel Kronvex's judgment like chains wrapping around her soul. The tribunal did not bluff. They would wipe him from existence as easily as one snuffs out a candle. Jean Grey was many things: a hero, a warrior, a woman who had lived, died, and been reborn in the heart of the cosmos. But she was not a murderer. And so, with a voice that barely escaped her lips, she whispered the impossible. "Yes." And the heavens trembled. A storm of silence followed Jean's whisper. The world seemed to freeze, as if even time itself struggled to process what had just been spoken. Across the city, the tribunal's golden enforcers stood motionless, their radiant bodies casting long, blinding streaks across the shattered skyline. The sky above still gaped open, a wound in reality, its edges flickering with cosmic fire. And in the center of it all, Deadpool, of all people, was at a loss for words. Jean Grey, the woman whose name was legend, whose power had sundered worlds, had just agreed to something unthinkable. She didn't look at him. Her gaze remained locked onto the tribunal's lead judge, Kronvex the Absolute, as though daring him to revoke this cruel decree. Kronvex did not. His towering form pulsed with otherworldly authority, and when he spoke, his voice rang across the fabric of existence. "The vow has been spoken. The balance is restored." A pause, a hesitation, as if some hidden force resisted the finality of his words. And then, "Bud is not yet sealed." Jean's heart clenched. "What do you mean?" Deadpool exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "Oh, great. There's always fine print." Kronvex turned his gaze to the unbreakable contract of the cosmos, glowing with shifting symbols in his massive, outstretched palm. "This union is not yet bound in eternity. A celestial bond requires a true ceremony overseen by the highest forces in existence." His golden eyes narrowed. "If the covenant is not completed, the judgment shall return, and the price shall be twice as severe." Jean barely heard him. She was already moving, her pulse a war drum in her ears. "You tricked me." "The law is absolute," Kronbeck said. "The multiverse must witness the binding. It must be." Jean lashed out, a wave of fire erupting from her palm, scorching the very air. The Phoenix force burned through her skin, a flickering halo of rage. The attack never reached him. The tribunal's shield was beyond mortal comprehension, absorbing the blast like a black hole swallowing the dying star. She knew it was useless, and yet, in that moment, she needed to strike, to fight, to do anything other than let this nightmare continue. A gloved hand settled on her wrist. "Jean," Deadpool murmured. No joke, no sarcasm, just her name. A steady weight in an unraveling world. For the first time, she turned to face him. Deadpool, the man who had turned battlefields into stand-up routines, stood before her in stillness. His mask covered his face, but she could feel the quiet resolve beneath. He wasn't afraid. Not of the tribunal. Not of her. Not of the cosmic absurdity that had forced their paths together. "I'll make it easy on ya," he said, his voice softer now. "You don't gotta mean it. We just do the thing, make it official, and poof, universal reset button. Nobody dies, nobody burns, and you never have to see me again." The tribunal's enforcers shifted, their golden bodies humming with expectation. Time was running out. Jean wanted to deny it, to scream that this was ridiculous, that there had to be another way. But there wasn't. So instead, she whispered the only answer left. "When?" Kronvex turned his palm, and the cosmos itself bent to his will. 3 days. The edge of time shall bear witness. The ceremony must be completed. Then, just like that, the tribunal was gone. The sky healed. The world, as much as it could, returned to normal. And yet, as Jean stood there, staring at the city below, she knew nothing would ever be normal again. Deadpool exhaled beside her, slow and heavy. Then, after a long silence, "So," he said, clapping his hands together, "I guess that means I gotta find a tux. The universe does not pause for love." 3 days passed like whispers in a storm, slipping through the cracks of time as the cosmos itself prepared for an event both sacred and absurd. And now, at the very edge of existence, where stars were born and died in an endless waltz, the ceremony was about to begin. Jean Grey stood at the heart of it all, her pulse slow, steady, measured, but inside, a tempest raged. The edge of time was unlike any place she had ever seen. It was a cathedral built from galaxies, its towering spires sculpted from collapsing nebulae, its floor a sea of silver mist reflecting the infinite beyond. Cosmic monarchs, celestial titans, and beings who had long abandoned mortal forms gathered in silent witness. Gods stood beside conquerors, rivals beside allies. Even the living tribunal itself had arrived. 3 faces turned toward the altar, watching. And then there was him, Deadpool. He stood at the far end of the vast platform, draped in ceremonial black. His suit was modified, a sleek version of his usual attire, woven with threads of reality itself. It fit him disturbingly well, the red accents shimmering like embers beneath the void. His mask, still present, revealed only his eyes, sharper than usual, searching, waiting. As Jean walked forward, an unsettling truth crept into her mind. This wasn't a joke to him. The man who had laughed in the face of gods, who had turned death into a revolving door, was silent now, steady. And that was far more dangerous than any of his wisecracks. She reached the altar, facing him, the fabric of her own attire whispering with every step. She wasn't in white. No, She had refused that symbolism. Instead, she wore deep crimson, like the dying light of a sun, like something meant to be remembered in the final moments of dusk. The phoenix within her stirred, uneasy. The efficient, eternity itself, a being who was existence, spoke in a voice that was not a sound, but a truth woven into the marrow of all things. The vow must be spoken. Jean swallowed. Deadpool tilted his head, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. Red? She met his gaze, and something passed between them. A silent war, a whispered truce. She had expected mockery, expected some offhanded quip to shatter the weight of the moment. But it never came. Instead, he offered her his hands. And without thinking, without allowing herself time to process the madness of it all, Jean took them. A spark, barely there, a flicker of something that shouldn't exist between them. No. She tightened her jaw. This was a performance, a necessity, nothing more. Deadpool exhaled slowly, as if he had read her mind. Guess this is the part where we say nice things about each other, huh? She said nothing. His grip on her hands was firm, not possessive, not desperate, just there, like he was giving her the chance to choose, even now, when choice had long been stolen from them both. I know what this is, he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. I know what it isn't. A pause. But that doesn't mean I won't mean it. Her chest tightened. And then, with a slow breath, she whispered words that should not have been meant for him. But somehow, in that moment, they were. I see you. His fingers twitched. The universe trembled. And above them, the phoenix burned. The universe held its breath. Jean Grey stood at the edge of the altar, hands locked with the last man she ever expected to share a moment like this with. The air between them pulsed with something neither of them could name. It was not fate, not love, not yet. But it was real. The vast cathedral of the cosmos stretched around them, silent and waiting. Stars flickered in the distance, their dying light swallowed by the endless dark. Beyond the altar, celestial beings loomed, their faceless judgment pressing against her skin like an unspoken command. The vow had to be spoken. The ceremony had to be completed. The phoenix inside her raged against it. This is beneath you. He is beneath you. Burn the sky and be free. But Jean Grey was not just the phoenix. She was a woman. And in this moment, in this impossible, maddening moment, she was just Jean. Deadpool tilted his head, his grip on her hands unwavering. You sure you want to do this, Red? Last chance to say psych and blast me into another timeline. His voice was light, but there was something beneath it, something deeper, something waiting. Jean inhaled slowly. She couldn't look away from him. Maybe because no one had ever looked at her like this before. With reverence, with defiance, with something dangerously close to understanding. She lifted her chin, her voice steady. This is the price to save you. His fingers twitched, not just me. And she knew he was right. If she turned away now, the tribunal would not stop at Deadpool. They would burn through realities, dismantling the fragile balance she had fought so hard to protect. A single moment of cosmic trespass had spiraled into something far greater than either of them. She had no choice. But it felt like a choice when she spoke the words. The vow was written in the ancient tongue of the cosmos, a language older than time itself. Each syllable vibrated through her bones, carving itself into the very fabric of her existence. Deadpool, for once, was silent. He listened. And when it was his turn, he spoke, not with mockery, not with hesitation, but with a certainty that shook her to her core. And then the final words, the moment of binding. Jean felt the energy shift before she saw it. Golden light pouring from the sky, swirling around them like ribbons of molten eternity. The universe itself moved to seal the covenant. But then, something went wrong. A shudder rippled through the cosmic altar, a distortion in the fabric of reality itself. The celestial beings stirred, unreadable expressions flickering across their endless faces. Jean's breath caught. The phoenix inside her screeched in warning. And then, a crack, a rupture in the void. From the darkness beyond the ceremony, something entered. Something vast, something cold, something ancient. Jean's hands clenched around Deadpool's as the golden light twisted, corrupting, fracturing. The tribunal's enforcers turned, their forms flickering, unstable. The vow had been spoken, the universe had moved to bind them. But something else had come to claim them. Then the universe should have sealed the vow. Instead, it shuddered. Jean Grey felt it first. An unnatural stillness creeping through the fabric of reality, a silence too perfect to be real. The golden energy that had once wrapped around her and Deadpool, binding them in an unbreakable cosmic contract, flickered like a dying flame. Then came the shadow. It did not simply fall over the altar. It invaded it. An ancient cold presence seeped through the cracks of existence, curling around the stars like a hungry hand. The tribunal's enforcers staggered, their golden bodies flickering, warping, fading. Jean's breath caught. Something had broken through. Deadpool, ever himself, was the first to speak. "Sue, I take it this isn't part of the honeymoon package?" Jean didn't answer. She was already moving, turning toward the disturbance, her fingers burning with barely contained power. The phoenix inside her screamed, wings of fire threatening to erupt from her back, but she held it down. Not yet, not until she knew what they were facing. The shadow shifted. Then it stepped forward. A figure, tall and formless, woven from the fabric of forgotten nightmares. It had no face, only an absence where one should be. No voice, only the whisper of dead stars. But Jean knew it. She had felt its presence before, in the moments between waking and dreaming, in the echoes of destroyed worlds. The devourer of vows. A being that should not exist. The tribunal reacted first, their fractured forms reforming, golden energy surging toward the intruder. The figure did not move. It did not need to. The moment the cosmic force struck, the light was devoured, swallowed by the void of its form. The celestial judges staggered, their once omnipotent presence suddenly small. Jean's pulse pounded. That's not good. Deadpool gave a low whistle. "I know, I was hoping for an awkward post-wedding dinner, maybe a dramatic love triangle. Not whatever this is." The devourer turned toward them and spoke. Not in words, but in truths. In raw, undeniable law woven into the bones of existence. Jean's entire body went rigid. The force of its voice, its command, threatened to unravel her where she stood. Beside her, Deadpool merely tilted his head. "Huh. Usually, when people object to a wedding, they at least pretend to be related." The devourer did not react. It did not need to. Jean forced herself to breathe. "Who are you?" A pause, a silence that burned. Then, "I am the correction." The golden energy around them collapsed. The stars trembled. The ceremony had failed. The vow had not been sealed. Deadpool turned to Jean, his voice softer than before. "Okay, I'll bite." The devourer of vows loomed over the shattered altar, its form shifting like a wound in space itself. The stars around them flickered, retreating, as if light itself feared being consumed. Jean Grey could feel it, the unraveling. The vow between her and Deadpool had been spoken, but it had not been sealed. Now, existence itself hesitated, caught between two truths, a binding that should have been eternal and a force that refused to let it be. The tribunal's enforcers had already begun to collapse, their golden forms peeling away, consumed by the devourer's presence. Deadpool stepped closer to Jean, his voice quieter than before. "Sue, just to clarify, if this thing wins, we don't just get an annulment, right? We get full-on erased from the history books treatment." Jean's fingers curled into fists. "It's worse than that." Her voice was steady, but inside, the phoenix thrashed, searing through her veins like wildfire. "Not yet, not yet." The devourer turned toward them. The words weren't heard, they were felt, etched into the air itself, into the marrow of their bones. Jean forced herself to breathe. "Why?" Her voice carried across the void, steady, defiant. "What about us threatens the balance?" A silence stretched. The cosmos listened. And then, Jean's heart clenched. The words were not a threat, not an accusation. They were simply a truth, spoken as if it had already been decided long before either of them had existed. Deadpool let out a breath, slow and measured. For once, there was no joke, no quip, only a pause. Then, he turned to her, eyes unreadable beneath the red and black of his mask. And if we do? Jean swallowed, because that question was heavier than any vow. The devourer did not hesitate. And then it moved. A wave of pure nothingness erupted from its form, a force not of destruction but of erasure. The tribunal's remaining guardians tried to stop it, golden sigils flashing across the sky, and were instantly swallowed. Jean reacted before she could think, throwing her hands out, power bursting from her like a second sun. Fire roared through the void, wings of cosmic flame exploding from her back. The phoenix rose, screaming in defiance. The wave of nothingness met her, and for the first time stopped. The devourer hesitated, and then it did something Jean had not expected. It turned to Deadpool. The realization struck her like ice in her veins. It wasn't here for her. It was here for him. Deadpool blinked, hands lifting slightly. "Okay, so I'm getting some major 'you were a mistake' vibes, and honestly, I get enough of that from my own subconscious, so if you cold." The devourer lunged. Jean didn't think. She moved. Her hand slammed against Deadpool's chest, and in a single burst of fire and light, she pushed him out of reality. He vanished. Gone. And then the devourer screamed. The sound shattered the heavens. The entire fabric of existence quaked beneath its fury. Jean stood alone, burning, defiant, shaking from what she had just done, because she had saved him. But now, she was the only one left. The universe felt emptier. Jean stood alone in the ruins of the celestial altar, flames curling around her fingers, her breath ragged. The moment she had cast Deadpool out of reality, something inside her had ripped. It wasn't just the act of separation. It was the knowledge that she had done it to save him. And now she was his last trace. The devourer of vows loomed before her, its form shifting between light and shadow, a paradise given shape. Its faceless void turned toward her, unreadable, but it was angry. Jean could feel it in the way the cosmos trembled around them, in the way the tribunal's golden ruins dissolved into nothingness. "You were after him," she said, voice quiet but unyielding. "Not me." The devourer did not answer immediately. When it did, its voice was not words but law. "He was not meant to exist in your story." Jean's pulse pounded. The truth settled into her bones. It had never been about the ceremony, not the vow, not the tribunal's judgment. It had been him. Deadpool was something that did not belong in the script of her fate, a rogue element in a story written long before either of them had lived. And by loving him, choosing him, she had rewritten something cosmic, something the universe itself refused to allow. Her hands clenched into fists. "I don't accept that." The devourer stirred, the void around it warping. "Then you defy your own destiny." Jean's flame surged higher, gold and red reflecting in her eyes. "Then so be it." And she attacked. The phoenix screamed through her veins, wings of fire exploding outward as she hurled herself at the entity. She struck with the force of a collapsing star, her power warping space itself. The heat of her defiance tore through the darkness, carving streaks of light across the endless void. The devourer reeled. For the first time it stumbled, its form flickering as if reality itself was struggling to hold it together. Jean pressed forward, pushing harder, fire curling around her like a second skin. If the universe wanted to erase what she felt, if it wanted to tell her she was wrong, then she would burn that universe down. The devourer screamed. The sound shattered the air, breaking the fragile edges of existence. Jean's vision blurred, her own power raging beyond her control. But then, a voice. Faint. Distant. "Jean?" Her heart stopped. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. That voice. No. Impossible. The devourer turned, its void-like form twisting. The stars around them bent inward, the remnants of the tribunal flickering like dying embers. And then, from the fracture Jean had torn into the universe, Deadpool stepped through. His suit was scorched, his body bearing the marks of something far older than battle scars. But he was here. He was real. Jean's chest tightened. I sent you away, she breathed. Deadpool tilted his head, his voice quieter than usual. Yeah, well, his gloved fingers flexed. You're not the only one who breaks the rules, Red. The Devourer lurched. Jean saw the shift too late. A pulse of void energy erupted from its form, straight at Deadpool. Jean moved. Faster than thought, faster than fate itself. She threw herself between them, her flames igniting, her hands outstretched. And then, impact. The universe fractured. Jean Grey screamed. Jean felt the void slam into her, a force colder than death itself. For a moment, there was nothing. No fire, no thought, no self. Just absence. Then pain. It was not the kind she could fight through. Not the kind she could burn away. This pain was deeper, threaded into the fabric of existence itself. She was being unmade, torn from the pages of reality, just as the Devourer intended. But then, a hand caught her. Strong, familiar, unyielding. Deadpool. Through the swirling abyss of unraveling space, his grip held hers, fingers locking around her wrist as if he could anchor her to existence by sheer will alone. Hey, his voice was quiet, but steady, cutting through the chaos. Not letting you go, Red. Not now. Not ever. Jean's breath trembled. She could feel herself slipping. Pieces of her consciousness scattering like dying embers. The Devourer had won. The universe had decided she was never meant to love him. But Deadpool, he refused that truth. And in that moment, something changed. The void around them shuddered. Deadpool tightened his hold. Listen, I don't know much about cosmic love stories, but I do know one thing. His other hand reached up, brushing against her cheek, the gesture so impossibly gentle despite the destruction around them. I choose you. No tribunal, no devourer, just me. Jean's heart clenched. A choice. It had never been about fate. It had never been about balance. It had always been about choice. Something ignited inside her, not the phoenix, not cosmic rage, but something greater, something hers. Jean's eyes flared open, burning gold, but this time, not from destruction, from creation. With a single breath, she reached out, gripping Deadpool's hand, and together, they rewrote the law of existence itself. The universe trembled, the Devourer lurched. The void that had been consuming her reversed, imploding. The tribunal's ruins reassembled, golden energy spiraling back into place. The fabric of reality twisted, bending to their will. And then Jean spoke. Her voice was not a plea, not a question. It was finality. We were never a mistake. The Devourer screamed. Light erupted. The darkness fractured, shattered into 1,000 fading echoes. The tribunal's altar surged with energy, and the vow that had once been broken sealed itself in fire. A force beyond time roared through the cosmos, and then, silence. Jean gasped, her body trembling. She was whole. Deadpool was still there, holding her, his grip warm, real. Around them, the tribunal's enforcers were formed, their golden energy humming with new understanding. The Devourer was gone, defeated not by fire, not by power, but by something far greater. Deadpool exhaled. Sue, that's a yes to the till death do us part thing, right? Jean laughed, a sound full of breath, relief, life. She didn't answer with words. She didn't need to. The universe had already heard her. The vow was sealed. And this time, nothing could undo it.